Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by vampbug. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about Sisyphus. Maybe it was onto something? This is the entire Parley prompt. It says, why doesn't Sisyphus just stop? Is he stupid? And I think that having the post looming above my head is a good way to start the conversation. So you can see this is on a Reddit thread, r/absurdism. I like at the top that it says similar to r/philosophy memes. Anyway, that's the entire parlay. It doesn't come with anything else. Sisyphus. Why doesn't Sisyphus just stop? Is he stupid? So Sisyphus was punished by the gods for tricking them basically a lot of ways. We'll talk about it a little. By being forced to be in the underworld, rolling a boulder up a hill futilely, in futility, for eternity. So the boulder needs to get to the top, but he will never make it to the top. The boulder will always fall back down, and he's got to just keep doing that forever. That's the long and the short of it. Now, obviously, we could go way into what is all of the history and the lore behind Sisyphus and his myths. And we could go into, yeah, I could have gone to this Reddit thread and read all that stuff. But as I said in like just a few parlay ago, which makes me even more certain that Vampbug knows I'm not going to do that. If you're asking me, you know that's not what we're gonna do. You know that what we're gonna do is I'm gonna say something like, if you had nothing else to do for like the rest of eternity, except push a boulder up a hill, and you know the boulder isn't gonna get to the top of the hill, would you never push the boulder? I don't think that's that stupid. I actually think that's somewhat enlightened. In Hades, Hades by Supergiant Games, the video game, Sisyphus is a friend to the protagonist, Zagreus, and you meet him as a pretty chill, enlightened, should we go there, individual, who seems to have come to peace with the idea that he isn't going to get the boulder up the hill. He still pushes it. He still pushes the boulder. And this also allows us to interrogate one, I think, critical aspect of the myth, or rather, a lack thereof of an aspect of the mythology, which is why Sisyphus does push the boulder up the hill still. Now, it's framed, I would argue, in the mythology, the way that all such things are framed. There's a bit of abstraction, r/absurdism, after all, where there just kind of isn't a reason. He just has to, even though it won't go anywhere. Now, in Hades, they offer the explanation that the Furies, the punishers of the underworld, will whip him, punish him in some way if he doesn't keep futilely pushing the boulder up the hill, more or less. But I don't know. I don't know if there's all that mechanical an explanation. That may be a modern sensibility. That's all I'm trying to point out. But it would be easy enough to just make up some reason why he has to keep doing it. Again, in that way, this is sort of a hilarious conundrum. I mean, I suspect that on that Reddit thread, there's more discussion like this. What is the point of getting the boulder to the top anyway? The gods are just gonna let him go? In life, you complete your task, your completely pointless task in this meaningless life on this meaningless earth. And oh, that's so good because then you get to go on to the next one. Oh, wow, what a treat. It's not pointful to push the boulder up the hill and get it to the top. So it's okay if it's pointless to push the boulder. Points aren't valuable or awarded for that matter. It's not as if anyone is scoring the things that you do other than, well, speaking for myself anyway, yourself. That's my initial response. It's not very stupid to do something without a goal. That isn't stupid. That is enlightened, perhaps, you might say. Obviously, when you have material concerns, it's a little bit of a different story, but he doesn't. A more practical approach to take is that Sisyphus is a notorious trickster in mythology. The reason Sisyphus is in trouble is because he's an uncommonly clever, sly fox against the gods. He was a king who, again, we're not really going to get into the particulars of the mythology, but he was a king who basically tricked other, guests to his kingdom and gods and demigods to further his own reign. And that's, more or less why he got in trouble. Specifically, what he got in trouble with which deity, I don't think is the main point. The main thing is he's an uncommonly clever person. Perhaps it's trying to say, this mythology, that he's being forced to do something uncommonly stupid. You could then ask, did the people who heard these myths first, or made up these myths, did they think it was stupid that he was pushing the boulder up the hill forever? I want to say yes. It seems like that's the point of the myth. It's really only a modern sensibility, I think, that reveals that perhaps that isn't so silly after all. Not that people didn't think that being detached from a goal or material gain was good way back when, of course. But these myths often served the role as being a sort of general societal deterrent that, tricking people, the people in power perhaps, wasn't going to go well. It was going to come back around to bite you, and it would end up being more trouble than it was worth. You're not being so clever as you think, perhaps it's meant to say. So I'm not trying to say that I think that the idea that it's kind of enlightened to do something without a set goal, I'm not trying to say that idea wasn't available at the time. I just doubt that this parlay would have come out of somebody hearing this myth at the time in the Greco-Roman context. I don't know, maybe it would have, but go figure. I think that it's more of a response, maybe, to our mass consumerism, that we think that material possessions are such an issue as well, though a lack of materialism would have probably been seen as a good or enlightened thing to a lot of people for most of humanity's history. Obviously, it was just impractical for a lot of that time, right? The idea that we are even flirting with the subject of it being a good thing is somewhat of a privilege. It takes a lot of work to engineer your environment to be not defined by material possessions. This is not a thing that you can do. It's not inexpensive to do that. In the long run, it probably is, but in the short term, keeping things minimal, it can be more expensive. The cheapest route will look messy. And maybe that's fine, but if you want that minimalist aesthetic, that is something that you do rather than don't do. If we really need to get into it, and we do, because you asked this open-ended parlay, the direction I'll now be going in is the idea of mental minimalism as opposed to physical minimalism. When you hear the idea that something is minimalist, you're thinking, visually, it's a kind of bare, stripped down, sleek, or rather Spartan. There's not many amenities, or it doesn't look like there are, or it's just very almost an association with high tech, don't you think? But I also think that there is something of a mental minimalism, not worrying about exactly what the purpose of the thing is, and just accepting that you wish to do it. Maybe that can be okay some of the time. Sisyphus might do well to worry less about exactly what the point of pushing the boulder up the hill is, and maybe comes to simply do it and not worry about it too much. After all, most of the things that we're doing anyway are just pointless. Now, I don't know. I mean, the idea that I posed at the beginning of the parlay, if you had nothing else to do, would you push the boulder? I don't know. Supergiant's Hades, Sisyphus, seems to suggest that that is sort of the final state for that philosophy. This is a concept that has grabbed me for a long time. The idea that you can kind of loosely calculate out where a philosophy will go until its sort of natural conclusion, or maybe it doesn't have one. And so you can say that an opinion or a state of mind or a course of action, anyway, is more sensible to some extent if it is more further calculated. I've talked about this a little in previous parlay, but just as an example, the idea would be, is there a point to believing in our culture's promise of happiness by just getting a job and having kids or whatever? Well, one step along the chain of thought is no. Lots of people don't seem particularly happy. Therefore, the things our culture says will make you happy won't. Then I think there's a, in my opinion, further step along the sort of calculation that concludes, well, there's not necessarily anything wrong with getting a job or having kids or whatever, so long as that's what you want. The problem is the lack of purpose behind those desires. You can go a little further and say, well, but what the heck is purpose? But you're suggesting that you would kind of have your own good purpose, which there maybe isn't a good material or direct purpose. Purposelessness seems to be the theme of the day for the universe. And then maybe even further beyond that, I'm not the Platonic ideal philosopher, I don't know. But you'd get to, let's say, thinking about the journey over the destination and trying to maximize those things. What is good about the journey? Is maximizing a somehow in error, or there's something less enjoyable about maximizing things? How much would you maximize if you weren't worried about a thing? It doesn't seem very enlightened, if you want to throw that word around, which I guess we are in this parlay, to copy the meta build for a game because you think that you need to do the right thing. Well, there was no point in making the decisions if you're not supposed to make the decisions. So the game is either kind of bad in that way, or it's okay to make the decisions. On the other hand, making your own decision isn't like better. It's not more good of you to have made your own decision than just copied somebody else's, simply because nothing has any value. So it isn't, some people act like, well, I made this specific build, you just copied a build, and therefore I'm better than you. No, they're not. In fact, there's a strong argument that they're an idiot who wasted their time, because there is nothing accomplished by making your own build other than that you kind of did your own thing. And when people choose to copy a build instead, well, they also chose to do their own thing. That's fine, provided that they chose to copy a build. There's really no moral high ground there, ontological, existence, driving purpose of existence based high ground there. They both have equal, infinitely low value. And I would argue that the virtue of humans is simply us deciding to try things the way we like. So as long as you're doing that, there's nothing good about any approach anyway. You might as well just do, I think probably the thing we're going to feel most at home doing. I would be interested, given infinite time that I don't have, to explore the concept of whether there is some merit to humans kind of focusing on their strength, which I think is generalism. I think humans are very strong generalists, and so maybe that's a good thing to maximize a little bit. And a lot of people sell themselves short or make cardboard cutouts of themselves by specifying heavily. But then again, a lot of specifications in our society are actually not very specific. They require a lot of generalism. For example, if you're like a mechanical engineer, this is a profession that requires a lot of versatility, right? So to say, well, you only experience yourself focused on that one pursuit, that one discipline, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing it wrong as a human because you didn't embrace your generalism or whatever, if there's even any real merit to that when you dig down a bit further. It's still using a general approach. It's maybe more obvious in my line of work. Like to say, oh, you're just making videos, that isn't a particularly open-ended thing. I think it's easier for more people to tell that actually it does require like rather a broad set of specializations. And it isn't very focused on being good in one specific area. I would argue this is one of the professions where it matters the least that you be good, in my humble opinion. Though there's reward for things going well, I think it's largely a matter of just doing things intentionally if you do a thing on purpose. It's pretty much good. I don't know. That was a lot. That was a lot of words to say that I'm not convinced there is any that there's any real problem with doing something in futility. But I'm also not entirely convinced that would be the settling point for someone given eternity to think about that. I suppose that when we see Sisyphus in Hades, we we aren't seeing him having had eternity to think about it. Supergiant's Hades takes place maybe still in the Greco-Roman age, and so Sisyphus hasn't been down there that long. It's not entirely clear. Something relation to the surface as well, like time's relation to the surface. So I suppose that's a good way to hand wave it, but that's hand waving the hand waving. The point we're trying to interrogate is, well, what if we went down to Hades now, and Sisyphus was there? Well, he has been there for thousands of years now. So what does he think now? You know, and is he going to change his mind again? How many more times? I feel like there's kind of three answers. The first one is it's actually pretty easy to reach the sort of end of the philosophical calculating. A lot of people in our current society get very little time to do this. So it might be surprisingly easy, or you can do it surprisingly quickly if you just have the time to do it. A lot of people who are famous philosophers in our human history are people who took certainly a lot more time than other people to think about this stuff. And so maybe if you had a couple hundred years, which is still way more than any of those people had, that's more than enough time, and you kind of get to, the end of whatever most people will figure out. I could easily see someone being stuck in their ways for all of that time, though. You can't just give anybody that time and then they'll come to philosophical breakthroughs. You would need the right teaching tools. So the amount of time it would take, depending on who it was, could vary wildly. I don't think it's unrealistic when an extremely old being is depicted as having like a surprisingly shallow psychological hangup. I think that's what you would expect. If every human alive right now lived 2,000 years, I think you would see many people would make surprisingly little progress, or I don't think it would surprise me, while other people would make what seems like disproportionately more progress. It's not that those people are that much stronger, I just think that having a good starting point makes a big difference over time. That initial hurdle of kind of willing to kill your darlings or interrogate the mental biases you have, that takes most people longer than their entire life. And so I wonder how much longer it would take. But once you've gotten over that, I don't know. I mean, for myself anyway, I feel like between when I didn't realize I was doing that and after I did, I made most of the progress I've made in my life in a very short time, from like an ontological, like, existence perspective. Maybe in other ways I built up to that over the course of my life. Sure. Anyway, so one way to look at it would be, no, you can actually get there pretty quick, provided you have the right conditions. And making major life decisions like Sisyphus did, defying the gods, well, it gives you something to think about. That seems like a decent starting point if one were to pursue the ontology. Possibility number two. It takes an extremely long time, or it takes longer than there is. That is, the amount of time is essentially infinite. Maybe I'll use a little metaphor here. The first option, where you can kind of get to the bottom of the philosophy pretty easily, is sort of like if quarks are the bottom of atomic theory. You go down from the surface level and then you're seeing, organelles, and then you're seeing molecules, and then you're seeing atoms, and then you're seeing quarks or fundamental particles. I understand I'm hand waving quite a lot. I'm not an incredibly skilled physics student, but you get the gist of it, right? Let's say that that's the bottom. That's it. Like, that's the smallest thing. You can't focus more, and there's more stuff. You can't. Let's assume. That's kind of option one. Option two would be there is no bottom, or it's after thousands of years you would still be going down the philosophical rabbit hole. But the parallel to physics would be if there are just more variants of smaller and smaller bodies or whatever, further and further down. It kind of seems like that's what it is going up, but I guess it might be that after you get to galaxies, there aren't multiple universes, maybe, And then you can keep going up and up, but there aren't new things, you could say. There are just more of those. There is a biggest thing, but there are still more of them. And that would be option 3. Option 3 is that you won't stop changing your position philosophically if you go forever, but it's not because there isn't really an end. It's because the end is a conclusion that causes you to change your opinion indefinitely. So this would be, there you find the biggest thing is a galaxy, but you're still going to go to different galaxies. That ends up being sort of the only reasonable perspective. Sisyphus will at times choose to push the boulder up the hill for a few thousand years and then decide to take a break from that for a few thousand years or something like that. I think it's option 3. I want to live forever, so I suppose I do think it's option 3, don't I? Because if it's option 1 or 2, well, you're either going to be working on something forever with no sort of ground state. You won't make a conclusion. No, I don't think we're going to conclude that there is meaning in the universe. There's nothing like that. There isn't going to be a destination either way. But the idea that there's no point in even furthering the philosophy, that I do think that would feel less good than coming to at least some good conclusion point where you feel, yeah, you can kind of wiggle around at this level of understanding and it feels good. And if everything is quite boring, if you're given long enough to ponder it after only a short time, well, that doesn't sound very good either. I want to live forever, predicated on the idea that it will be interesting to do so. Like that it won't be really boring to do so. It could actually be fairly boring and I'd probably be okay. But anyway, that is a core assumption for me as a person. I've spoken to a lot of people over the years that say, I just don't want to live forever. And as I get into them, okay, whoops. Well, sometimes, sure, if you know what I'm saying. As I get into the subject with them, excuse me, we don't kiss and tell here, but sorry about that. Usually it comes to light that the reason they don't want to live forever is predicated on the idea that it will get boring, or that I think a lot of the time I hear people kind of subconsciously knowing that the way they're living their life is kind of defined by stalling problems they have, and they maybe subconsciously know that they would have to confront those things if they lived forever, and they don't want that. I think that whether people know that or not, that is true of most people. That is a favored by the circumstances way to live your life. You don't need to confront your issues forever. You just need to confront them for about 100 years, and then you'll die, and it's no big deal. So people think. Now, I don't view it that way, but I don't think it's ridiculous that people do view it that way. Considering that you're not going to live forever, that is a valid response to the situation, though I don't think it's a good one. It would be silly to say that that doesn't work. Of course it does. People do it all the time. I don't know. Anyway. So I feel strongly that it's probably option 3. Sisyphus will choose to push the boulder up and down the hill from time to time and give up from time to time. Won't Sisyphus, in the version where he's being spurred on by the Furies to keep pushing the boulder, simply accept the pain of being whipped by the Furies, since he's living an immortal life down there? And that will cease to matter at some point? You see what I mean? I don't know. Again, it's kind of a metaphysical reality, so maybe he's being forced to not get used to the sensation of pain. You know how if you whack a martial arts training dummy enough, your nerves kind of deaden and it doesn't hurt as much? Well, maybe in the underworld that doesn't happen. Again, you could get into technicalities like this. I kind of feel like that state of being is what's implied by myths about the underworld, though. Where, it's implied that they are not making progress. It's implied that this is bad. This is not an opportunity to meditate and learn. It's not good. But I don't think that's what this thread is about. So I don't feel the need to get overly hung up on that. I just think it's a relevant thing to mention since we have an entire parlay to talk about this absurd subject. Come on, what do we not have time to bring that up? So go figure. But I think that's about it. I'm a fan. I've always been a fan of Sisyphus. I also really like Orpheus and Eurydice. That's also in Supergiant's Hades. Orpheus and Eurydice is another classic. Um, that's the whole thing. Oh boy. Bedtime stories from my childhood making me sleepy. That's the whole thing with looking back as you're leaving the underworld. I'm not crazy, right? That is that. Um, and I've always found that to be a very relatable feeling. The sort of need to look, even when you feel like it doesn't, mean anything. Um, Let me just refresh my memory that she has to follow him from behind and he can't turn around to look at her. Yes, right, it's that one. Okay, just making sure I'm not crazy. Um, yeah, I don't know. I just think it's relatable. I've always had this feeling like to me, it's almost like if you don't look, there is something there. There's sort of a feeling like that. And you might, as a much smaller microcosm of the waiting 1,000 years, how might your ideology change thing? I feel like if I had an extremely long time, I mean, I would become interested in what would happen if you didn't look for an extremely long time. I mean, nothing, common sense says. But there might be something interesting about, just how often we indulge our desire to check what seems like a dark spot in the environment, and what if you didn't do that for hundreds of years? What might that experience be like? Maybe this is just the sort of Stockholm syndrome of existing, where that isn't interesting at all, and it's just something that you would bide your time with if you had eternity, and that's actually not remotely interesting to someone who's lived a long time. uh that's somewhat scary, but I don't know. I don't know. I always think it's admirable when people write characters that are really old or going to exist a long time. To some extent, the people who wrote the initial Sisyphus myth or created the official Sisyphusian myth, but also just in stories like in Supergiant's Hades. I think it's brave, good that the writers made the decision to have Sisyphus have like a particular ideology about pushing the boulder up the hill. I think that's good, even though you can pick any possible idea like that to pieces. Would you really feel this way if you waited that long? I don't know. I guess one other depiction to mention is that sometimes beings that spend a long time contemplating existence are depicted as not trying to progress the ideology. They either kind of focus on one thing for a long time or just wait like a very long time to gain more perspective. The example that comes to mind is the Raiden Shogun from Genshin Impact. This is like a minor plot spoiler, but I think it's heavily implied by the narrative, so I don't have too much of a problem with it, but you can skip the end of the parlay if you want. A spends quite a long time contemplating what giving her people in Inazuma an eternity means. Perhaps because of the element of Electro's nature of being a flash, a lightning strike, something very temporary. And I also think this is really clever. Japanese culture has a big awareness of mono no oware, like the awareness of transience is maybe how I would translate it, but it's hard to translate. Things like sakura petals falling for a very short time, like things like that, right? There's a lot of Japanese aesthetic that is focused on extreme transience. One of the classic symbols is the train going by. The train comes and then it leaves, and that's like an event in your life going by. That's a very common trope used in Japanese film, and Japanese culture in general is quite focused on that idea. So it's really interesting to see how when they made Inazuma in Genshin Impact, the Raiden Shogun, the god of Inazuma, of Japan, basically in Genshin Impact, is defined by her interest in preserving or kind of countering that feeling, and thinks about it for millennia. We're made to understand as one of the most consistent nations in the world the game takes place in. So that's kind of a different topic. I feel like I don't consider that relevant, even for all the relatively irrelevant things we talked about. But that is a place for further thinking if you wish to contemplate this subject further. I've always found that approach fascinating, like not moving on from a certain subject, taking the time, spending the time since you have it to try to gain greater perspective on an approach that might seem short-sighted in our hopelessly short-minded perspective. That's interesting. Anyway, yeah, I thought this was a very, very fun parlay. Thank you for asking. These open-ended ones are a great companion to the longer, more scripted ones. So yeah, as I have frequently said, thank you for asking these. It's great to have a mix. They're always fun either way. Hope you enjoyed it.